He walked through the pristine wrought-iron gates of Whitmore Country Club, wearing a faded beige work shirt with rolled-up sleeves and an old baseball cap pulled low over silver hair. His weathered hands, marked with decades of honest work, clutched a manila envelope against his chest. The manicured lawns stretched endlessly before him, dotted with pristine white tables where members in designer clothing sipped champagne beneath crystal chandeliers visible through floor-to-ceiling windows. Harold paused at the marble entrance, removing his cap respectfully as he had been taught by his father 60 years ago. The afternoon sun caught the deep lines around his eyes, lines earned from a lifetime of squinting at seedlings and smiling at children who had never known hunger thanks to the gardens he built. "Excuse me, sir." Victoria Ashford's voice sliced through the peaceful afternoon air like shattered glass. Her designer heels clicked against the polished marble floor with military precision as she approached, her pearl necklace catching the light, her perfectly manicured fingers already gesturing dismissively. "I'm afraid there's been some significant mistake here." Harold looked up with gentle brown eyes that had seen both heartbreak and hope. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm looking for Thomas Whitmore. I have something important that belonged to his father." "The service entrance is around back," she interrupted sharply, her voice rising just enough to catch the attention of nearby members. "Maintenance staff and delivery personnel are strictly prohibited from using the main lobby. Surely you understand our policies regarding—" "Ma'am, I'm not here for maintenance work," Harold said quietly, his voice steady despite the flush creeping up his neck. "I have a personal matter to discuss with Mr. Whitmore about his late father and—" "Sir, please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." Victoria's tone grew increasingly hostile as a small crowd of members began to gather, their whispered conversations creating a buzz of judgment that filled the opulent space. Women in tennis whites and men in golf attire formed a semicircle of privilege, their eyes scanning Harold's modest appearance with barely concealed disdain. The security guard stepped forward, his hand moving toward Harold's elbow with practiced authority. "Come on, old-timer. Let's not cause a scene here." Harold's fingers tightened around the envelope, the final letter Martha had written before her death, asking him to finally step out of the shadows and accept recognition for their life's work. His eyes scanned the faces around him, faces filled with amusement, superiority, and the kind of casual cruelty that comes from never having struggled for anything meaningful. He had seen that look countless times before, but somehow it never stopped stinging, not because it hurt his pride, but because it reminded him of all the other Harold Cartwrights in the world. Good people dismissed simply for lacking the right clothes, the right accent, the right connections. What none of them knew was that tomorrow, their carefully constructed world of assumptions would crumble. The quiet man in work clothes standing before them carried secrets that would not only challenge everything they believed about worth and value, but would reveal that true power often wears the most humble disguise. The man they had just dismissed was Harold Benjamin Cartwright, and his extraordinary story began 47 years ago in the most forgotten corner of the city, where broken streetlights cast long shadows over abandoned lots filled with nothing but weeds, broken glass, and the dreams that poverty had crushed. After working 18-hour days as a night janitor while attending agricultural college during the day, Harold had discovered something revolutionary. Empty urban spaces weren't just eyesores, they were opportunities waiting to bloom. What started as a single community garden in 1978 had quietly grown into something unprecedented. Harold was the founder and driving force behind the Hope Green Foundation, an organization that had fundamentally transformed how communities approached food security, job training, and social healing. He had built the foundation from absolutely nothing, dedicating his degree in sustainable agriculture, his life savings of 847 and every spare moment of the next 4 decades to creating systematic change that rippled across generations. The foundation didn't just plant vegetables, it planted entire futures. The program had created a revolutionary model. Abandoned lots became thriving gardens, gardens became job training centers became small businesses, and small businesses became pathways out of poverty that had previously seemed impossible to escape. There was Maria Santos, a young mother of 3 who had been living in her car behind a gas station, feeding her children with whatever she could find in dumpsters. Harold personally spent 6 months teaching her hydroponic gardening in a converted warehouse space, showing her how to grow fresh produce year-round using recycled materials. Within 18 months, Maria was running her own urban farm cooperative, employing 14 people from her former homeless community and supplying fresh produce to 3 local schools. When Harold attended Maria's eldest daughter's college graduation ceremony 5 years later, he sat in the very back row, wearing the same beige shirt he wore everywhere, declining any recognition or mention in the graduation speech. But Maria found him afterward, tears streaming down her face as she introduced him to her professors as the man who saved my family's life and taught us that dignity grows from the ground up. His late wife, Martha, had been the brilliant architect of their medical outreach program, creating mobile health clinics that provided free screenings, vaccinations, and basic medical care at every garden site. Together, they had developed an integrated model that addressed not just hunger, but the healthcare deserts that plagued low-income communities. But Harold's impact extended far beyond individual success stories. The Hope Green Foundation had created a replicable system that other cities had begun adopting. Veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan found purpose and healing working with soil and plants. Former inmates discovered that growing food was a pathway to genuine respect and steady employment. Elderly residents isolated in urban apartments found community and purpose-tending shared gardens with neighborhood children. Harold never sought credit for any of it. When mayors wanted to present him with keys to the city, he sent program graduates to accept on behalf of the foundation. When newspapers tried to interview him about his revolutionary approach to urban development, he redirected them to the families whose lives had been transformed. When agricultural colleges invited him to speak about his methods, he declined and suggested they interview the people who had learned to feed their communities with their own hands. The man who had quietly revolutionized urban agriculture across 7 states still drove a 20-year-old pickup truck with 340,000 miles on it, shopped exclusively at thrift stores, and lived in the same modest 2-bedroom house he had purchased in 1981 for $23,000. The manila envelope clutched in his weathered hands contained something precious, Martha's final letter, written in her careful nurse's handwriting just 5 days before she passed away from the cancer they couldn't afford to treat at the expensive facilities. In that letter, she had asked him to do something he had never done in 47 years of service: accept public recognition for their work just once, so that others might be inspired to understand that extraordinary change happens through ordinary people willing to work in silence. But there was something else in that envelope, something that would soon reveal connections between Harold's quiet generosity and the very institution that had just rejected him. In the weeks following his humiliation at Whitmore Country Club, Harold continued his quiet work as if nothing had happened, though something deep inside him had shifted. Every Tuesday morning, he visited the Riverside Community Garden, where elderly residents from the nearby subsidized housing complex tended vegetables and herbs, alongside teenagers from the local high school's alternative education program. Mrs. Chen, 84 years old with arthritis-gnarled hands that moved like poetry among her tomato plants, always saved him a cup of tea brewed from medicinal herbs she grew herself using techniques her grandmother had brought from China. "You look troubled, Harold," she observed with the sharp insight that comes from 8 decades of reading faces. She poured the steaming amber liquid into a chipped ceramic mug that her late husband had made in pottery class 40 years earlier. "Something weighing heavy on your heart?" Harold shook his head gently, watching a group of teenagers harvest carrots they had planted 3 months ago under the guidance of Marcus Williams, a 19-year-old who had been headed straight for juvenile detention before discovering he possessed an almost mystical gift for coaxing life from seemingly dead soil. What Mrs. Chen didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Harold had been anonymously funding Marcus's full ride to agricultural college, just as he had done for 43 other young people over the years. The scholarship checks arrived quarterly from something called the Green Future Educational Trust, accompanied only by handwritten notes that read, "For those who understand that hope grows from the ground up." Marcus was now in his sophomore year, double majoring in sustainable agriculture and social work, spending his summers developing garden programs for juvenile detention centers across 3 states. His transformation from angry, directionless teenager to passionate advocate for food justice had become a model that other programs were trying to replicate. Meanwhile, across town at Whitmore Country Club, Victoria Ashford was dealing with a mystery that had been bothering her for nearly 4 years. Anonymous donations had been arriving at the club's annual charity drives with clockwork precision, always substantial amounts, always arriving exactly when their fundraising efforts seemed to be falling short of their goals. The donations came from something called the Green Future Charitable Trust, But every attempt to identify the donor had led to dead ends. The checks were legitimate, the amounts were significant, and the timing was almost supernatural in its accuracy. "It's as if someone has inside information about our fundraising progress," Victoria mentioned to her assistant while reviewing the latest donation of $75,000 that had arrived just as their pediatric hospital wing campaign was stalling. "They always seem to know exactly how much we need to reach our targets." What Victoria couldn't have known was that Harold had been quietly monitoring the club's charitable activities through publicly available tax documents, ensuring that worthwhile causes didn't suffer simply because wealthy people sometimes needed encouragement to open their wallets. That same Tuesday afternoon, Harold stood outside Whitmore Country Club's gates once again, but this time he wasn't seeking entry. He was watching through the iron bars as children from the local children's hospital enjoyed a special therapeutic luncheon on the pristine lawn, their wheelchairs and medical equipment creating a beautiful contrast against the manicured grass. The pediatric wing renovation that had made this event possible, the one that had saved countless young lives over the past 3 years, had been completed thanks to an enormous anonymous donation of $2, $3 million that had arrived just as the hospital's fundraising campaign was about to fail. Harold touched the faded scar on his left palm, a permanent reminder of the day 27 years ago when he had pulled 8-year-old Thomas Whitmore from the deep end of the lake behind this very building. The boy had been blue-lipped and unconscious, having slipped away from his nanny while chasing a butterfly near the water's edge. Harold had been trimming the hedge maze on the club's grounds, earning extra money during the weekend to help pay for Martha's nursing school tuition when he heard the distinctive splash followed by panicked screaming. Without hesitation, he had dropped his pruning shears and dove into the frigid October water, pulling the unconscious child to safety and performing CPR until the paramedics arrived. 27 years had passed since that day. Thomas was now a successful businessman with children of his own, serving on the boards of multiple charitable organizations, but Harold had never sought recognition or reward for saving his life. In Harold's mind, you didn't save a drowning child because you expected gratitude. You saved them because that's what decent human beings do for one another. But silence, Harold was slowly learning, sometimes enabled injustice to flourish unchecked. As he walked away from the club's gates, watching his shadow stretch long across the sidewalk in the late afternoon sun, an idea began forming in his mind, one that would honor Martha's final request, while perhaps teaching others that genuine worth often wears work clothes and speaks in whispers rather than shouts. The envelope in his jacket pocket seemed to grow heavier with each step, carrying not just Martha's letter, but the weight of a lifetime spent believing that good work should speak for itself. But maybe, just maybe, it was time for the work to finally speak out loud. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made everything seem possible. Harold returned to Whitmore Country Club wearing his only dress shirt, a simple white cotton button-down that Martha had pressed for him before every important occasion for 38 years. It was still modest, still humble, but clean and creased with the kind of care that speaks to dignity rather than wealth. The manila envelope rested in his jacket pocket alongside something else, a small, faded photograph and a yellowed newspaper clipping that would soon change everything. Victoria spotted him the instant he crossed the threshold into the marble lobby. Her perfectly composed expression immediately shifted to one of barely controlled irritation. "Sir, I thought we made it abundantly clear yesterday that this establishment has very specific policies regarding—" "Victoria, wait just a moment." The voice that interrupted her was deep, commanding, and carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Thomas Whitmore III had just emerged from the private elevator that served the club's executive offices, his expensive charcoal suit impeccably tailored, his presence immediately commanding the attention of everyone in the expansive lobby. But his eyes that had seen boardrooms and charity galas and every manner of important gathering, were fixed on Harold with an expression that Victoria had never witnessed before. It was a look of complete recognition mixed with something that might have been wonder, or perhaps the kind of shock that comes from encountering a ghost you never expected to see again. Thomas approached slowly, almost reverently, as if he were walking through a dream that might dissolve if he moved too quickly. Each step seemed to carry the weight of decades, and when he spoke, his voice cracked with emotion that had been building for 27 years. Harold Benjamin Cartwright, The lobby fell into the kind of profound silence that only occurs when something monumentally important is about to happen. Victoria's mouth opened slightly, confusion clouding her perfectly applied makeup as she looked between the two men, trying to understand how her carefully controlled environment had suddenly shifted beyond her comprehension. Harold looked up with those same gentle brown eyes that had comforted thousands of struggling families, a soft smile creasing his weathered face like sunrise, breaking across a landscape of hard-earned wisdom. "Hello, Thomas. You've grown quite a bit since the last time I saw you, though I suppose 27 years will do that to a person. I can't believe it's really you. I've been searching for you for over a decade." Thomas's voice grew stronger as the initial shock began to transform into something deeper, a mixture of gratitude, amazement, and the kind of joy that comes from solving a mystery that has haunted you for most of your adult life. He turned to address the growing crowd of members and staff who had gathered, drawn by the obvious significance of whatever was unfolding before them. "Ladies and gentlemen, this man saved my life when I was 8 years old. I was drowning in the lake behind this building during my father's memorial service preparation meeting. If Harold hadn't been there, if he hadn't acted without hesitation..." Thomas paused, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was saying and the implications of what Harold's presence might mean. Victoria stepped forward, her voice uncertain for perhaps the first time in her professional career. "Mr. Whitmore, surely there's been some kind of misunderstanding. This man is clearly not is the reason I'm standing here today." Thomas finished with quiet firmness that carried an edge of steel. "Harold, I've spent years trying to find you. My father talked about you constantly after that day. He called you the quiet hero and said you taught our entire family what real integrity looked like." Harold's eyes widened slightly, genuine surprise flickering across his features. He had never expected that his actions that day had left such a lasting impression on the Whitmore family. Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "But it's more than that, isn't it? The anonymous donations to our charitable causes, the mysterious Green Future Trust that has been supporting every major philanthropic effort in this community for the past decade, the funding for the pediatric wing at Mercy General Hospital, where my father spent his final months receiving such extraordinary care." Harold's weathered hands tightened almost imperceptibly around the envelope, but his expression remained calm, neither confirming nor denying Thomas's increasingly excited revelations. "My private investigator finally made the connection last month," Thomas said, pulling out his smartphone and scrolling through what appeared to be an extensive file. "The trust's tax documents, the timing of the donations, the specific causes supported, they all lead back to one person. You're not just Harold Cartwright the gardener, you're Harold Cartwright, the founder of the Hope Green Foundation, the man who has quietly revolutionized urban agriculture across 7 states and touched more lives than most people could impact in 10 lifetimes. Before Harold could respond, Thomas continued with building momentum. "I want everyone here to understand what they're witnessing. Hit that subscribe button right now, because you're about to hear a story that will restore your faith in humanity and show you that heroes walk among us every single day, usually wearing work clothes and asking for nothing in return." Harold reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the faded photograph, a picture of 8-year-old Thomas, soaking wet but grinning widely, standing beside a newly planted oak sapling in the club's memorial garden. "Your father asked me to take this picture the day after I pulled you from the lake. He said he wanted to remember the moment his son learned that real strength comes from planting things rather than just taking from the world." Thomas stared at the photograph, tears beginning to stream down his face, as memories that had been locked away for decades suddenly flooded back with crystal clarity. He never stopped talking about that lesson. "He said you taught us both that day that genuine wealth isn't measured by what you own, but by what you give away without expecting anything in return." The crowd around them had grown larger, members and staff alike, drawn by the obvious emotional weight of what was unfolding. Victoria stood frozen at the edge of the gathering, her face pale as the full implications of her actions and her fundamental misunderstanding of who Harold really was began to sink in with devastating clarity. Harold then withdrew the yellowed newspaper clipping, a small article from the local paper, dated exactly 27 years ago, with the headline, "Local Groundskeeper Saves Drowning Child at Private Club." Below it was a grainy photograph of Harold, much younger but wearing the same humble expression, declining to be interviewed about his heroic actions. "I kept this," Harold said softly, "because Martha always said that some moments change everything, even when we don't realize it at the time. She was right, as she usually was about most things. Around them, the members of Whitmore Country Club found themselves witnessing something they would never forget: the complete collapse of their assumptions about worth, value, and the nature of true nobility. And at the center of it all stood a simple man in work clothes, holding the threads of a story that was about to reveal just how profoundly they had misjudged not just him, but perhaps everything they thought they knew about what really matters in this world. Thomas turned to face the assembled crowd with the commanding presence of someone who had just discovered a truth so profound it demanded to be shared immediately. His voice carried across the marble lobby with the kind of authority that comes from absolute moral clarity. Ladies and gentlemen, I need you to understand exactly what has just happened here. You are looking at Harold Benjamin Cartwright, the man who has been anonymously supporting this community, this very institution, and countless charitable causes for over 3 decades. The man who was just told he doesn't belong here is quite possibly the most important person who has ever walked through these doors. Victoria's face had progressed from pale to ashen, her perfectly manicured hands trembling slightly as she gripped her clipboard like a lifeline. Mr. Whitmore, I had absolutely no idea. I was simply following our established protocols for... Protocols? Thomas's voice sharpened with an edge that made several people in the crowd step back instinctively. The protocol of judging a human being's worth by the price of his clothing. The protocol of assuming someone's value based on whether they drive a luxury car or wear a Rolex. The protocol of treating kindness as if it were some kind of threat to our precious exclusivity. Harold raised his weathered hand gently, his voice soft but carrying enough authority to quiet even Thomas's righteous anger. Thomas, please. She was protecting something she believed was important. I understand that impulse, even if I disagree with the methods. But Thomas wasn't finished. He had 27 years of gratitude and a decade of searching behind his words, and he wasn't going to let this moment pass without ensuring everyone understood its significance. This man, Thomas continued, gesturing toward Harold with obvious reverence, has funded scholarship programs that have sent over 400 young people to college. His Hope Green Foundation has created permanent employment for more than 5,000 families. The community gardens you drive past every day without a second thought, Harold built those with his own hands, often working 18-hour days while supporting a sick wife and maintaining a full-time job. Margaret Wells, one of the club's most senior members, and a woman whose family had been part of Whitmore's social fabric for 4 generations, stepped forward with tears streaming down her cheeks. Her voice shook with emotion as she addressed Harold directly. Harold, you're the anonymous donor who paid for my grandson's cancer treatment 3 years ago, aren't you? The mysterious benefactor who covered everything our insurance wouldn't handle, nearly $500,000 in experimental treatments that saved Jamie's life. Harold nodded quietly, his expression unchanged. How is Jamie doing these days, Mrs. Wells? He's been cancer-free for 18 months now, thanks to you, she sobbed. We spent 2 years trying to find out who had saved our family. We wanted to thank you, to somehow repay... There's nothing to repay, Harold interrupted gently. Jamie's health is thanks enough. But Margaret's revelation had opened floodgates. Other voices began emerging from the crowd, each one adding another layer to the extraordinary scope of Harold's quiet generosity. You funded the complete renovation of the children's library, called out Dr. Robert Chen, the club's treasurer. The reading program that's taught over 1,000 kids to love books. The job training center for unemployed veterans, added Patricia Morrison, her voice thick with recognition. My brother David found work there after coming back from Afghanistan. You saved his life just as surely as if you'd pulled him from that lake. The community health clinic that provides free medical care, said another voice. The scholarship fund for single mothers returning to college. The emergency housing assistance program. With each revelation, Victoria's horror deepened. She watched in dawning realization as Harold's fingerprints were revealed on virtually every meaningful charitable effort their community had undertaken in the past decade. Every cause they had supported, every life they had helped change, every success they had celebrated, Harold had been there first, working quietly in the background, asking for nothing. Harold, Thomas said, his voice now thick with emotion and profound respect. My father left very specific instructions in his will. If we ever found the man who saved my life and taught our family about the true meaning of generosity, we were to offer you lifetime membership to this club, along with a formal position as chairman of our charitable foundation board. Harold smiled with the kind of gentle wisdom that comes from a lifetime of understanding what truly matters. I appreciate the gesture more than you know, Thomas, but I didn't come here seeking membership or recognition or positions of honor. He pulled out Martha's letter again, his hand steady despite the magnitude of the moment. My wife asked me to do something before she passed away. She wanted me to share our story just once so that others might understand that real change doesn't happen in boardrooms or at charity galas. It happens quietly, in small daily acts of kindness that nobody sees or applauds. Harold looked directly at Victoria, his expression completely free of anger, resentment, or any desire for revenge. Ma'am, you were trying to protect something you believed was precious and exclusive. I understand that instinct. But sometimes the things we work hardest to protect become prisons that keep out the very people who could teach us what we're missing. The room fell into the kind of profound silence that accompanies moments of genuine transformation. Victoria looked around at faces that reflected her own shame, confusion, and slowly dawning understanding. In her effort to maintain the club's exclusivity and prestige, she had nearly turned away the person who embodied everything their organization claimed to value: service, generosity, and positive impact on their community. How do we make this right? Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. How do we even begin to apologize for— You already have, Harold replied simply. By listening, by understanding that worth isn't measured in dollars or designer labels, by recognizing that every person who walks through these doors, whether they're wearing a tuxedo or work clothes, has a story worth hearing and dignity worth honoring. Harold carefully folded Martha's letter and returned it to his jacket pocket, the paper worn soft from decades of being carried close to his heart. When he looked up, his eyes held the quiet wisdom of someone who had spent a lifetime watching seeds transform into forests, understanding that the most important changes happen slowly, invisibly, in the fertile darkness where nobody is watching. Martha used to tell me that gardens teach us the most important lessons about life, he said softly, his voice carrying easily across the silent lobby. You plant something small and seemingly insignificant, tend it with patience and faith, and trust that time will reveal its true value. People are exactly like that too. He turned toward Victoria, his weathered face reflecting not triumph or vindication, but the kind of gentle understanding that comes from having been misjudged so many times that anger has transformed into compassion. Ma'am, you were protecting something you believed was precious and worth preserving. I respect that instinct, even if I question the methods. But sometimes the most valuable things don't announce themselves with expensive packaging. Thomas wiped his eyes, his voice trembling with emotion that had been building for 27 years. Harold, how can we possibly make this right? How can we honor what you've done, what you've given? You already have, Harold replied, his smile gentle but profound. By listening with open hearts. By understanding that true worth isn't determined by what someone wears, where they come from, or how much money they have in their bank account. Every person who walks through those gates carries stories of struggle, dreams, heartbreak, and hope. Each one deserves to be seen as fully human. He gestured toward the opulent surroundings with a gesture that encompassed not just the marble and crystal, but the very mindset that had created such spaces. This is beautiful, and there's nothing wrong with beauty or success or even exclusivity, as long as we remember that these things are meant to serve life, not replace it. The moment we start believing that luxury makes us more valuable than others, we've lost something essential about what it means to be human. Harold looked around the room one final time, his gaze touching each face with the kind of attention that makes people feel truly seen. Martha and I never needed recognition or applause. Our reward was watching a formerly homeless mother teach her daughter to read using books from the library we helped build. Our satisfaction came from seeing a young veteran discover that growing food could heal trauma in ways that therapy couldn't reach. Our joy was in knowing that somewhere, a child was eating fresh vegetables grown in soil that had once been nothing but abandoned wasteland. He placed his worn baseball cap back on his silver hair with the same quiet dignity he had carried for 73 years. The gardens will continue growing with or without us. The scholarships will keep sending deserving kids to college. The food will keep feeding hungry families. And somewhere out there, another quiet soul is planting seeds of kindness that will change the world, one small act of love at a time. Harold began walking toward the door, his footsteps echoing softly against the marble. But as he reached the threshold, he paused and turned back with a smile that seemed to illuminate the entire room. Remember this: the richest soil often looks the most ordinary. It's dark, humble, easily overlooked, but that's where the most extraordinary things grow. The same is true for people. Sometimes the most valuable person in the room is the one you almost didn't notice. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving the members of Whitmore Country Club forever changed by their encounter with a simple man who had quietly devoted his entire life to proving that love, expressed through action, remains the most powerful force in the universe. If this story stirred something in your heart, there's another one waiting that will show you just how extraordinary ordinary people can be when they choose compassion over comfort.